Hello, and welcome to Lesson 5. We're getting ever so close to finishing our music. Today and tomorrow will probably be the hardest lessons to complete because there are so many variables to think about when doing this step. However, if you notated a piece of music from Lesson 2 where everything fell on the bold lines like this, that will make today much easier. Today, in this lesson, we will discuss how to notate the piece where everything falls on the bold lines or on the beat, and tomorrow we will discuss how to notate your harder piece. First, we will need to talk about the rhythmic values of the signs that we learned to draw yesterday. We will be using a lot of fractions, so I hope you're paying attention to your math class when they covered fractions because we will certainly be using them today. We'll start with the whole note. The whole note is called such because it takes up an entire measure. If we recall from yesterday, we learned how to divide our music with bar lines every 4 beats. If you recall, a beat equals 2 of these little boxes like so. So the bar lines divide the measures. So this is a measure, this is a measure, and this is a measure. So if a whole note takes up an entire measure, it gets 4 beats. Lo and behold, a whole note does indeed get 4 beats. Unfortunately, Songmaker doesn't have the option of allowing the notes to sustain for more than a single block. However, this is what a whole note would sound like. When we are notating our music from Songmaker, we will simply have to imagine if we want our note to sustain for the full 4 beats or if we want it to be shorter. If a whole note takes up an entire measure, how much of a measure would you assume a half note takes up? If you said half of a measure, you were correct. Let's go ahead and do so. If we divide the measure into half, there are 2 beats on this side and 2 beats on this side. That means that a half note gets 2 beats of sound, like this. What if we were to divide the measure into quarters? We would have 4 equal portions like this. Notice that there are 2 little boxes in each of these sections, which means, if we recall, a beat equals 2 of these boxes, which means a quarter note gets 1 beat of sound, like this. The next one we're going to talk about is a little bit more complicated because it doesn't divide the measure equally. It might be simply easier to just memorize that a dotted half note gets 3 beats. But let me go ahead and explain it mathematically for those of you who are more mathematical thinkers. What the dot means is that you take half of the note value originally shown, in this case a half note. Half of a half note is 1 beat. Then you simply add that beat to the original note value, being a half note, which gives you 3 beats of sound. Here is an example of a dotted half note followed by a quarter note and then repeated. So we have covered how to notate sound, but how do we notate silence? This is where the rests come in. For each of our sounding values, or in other words, for each of the note values that have sound, we have a resting note value that corresponds to it. For example, here is our whole note that we learned that gets 4 beats. This is our whole rest that gets 4 beats as well. The difference is that the whole note gets 4 beats of sound, whereas the whole rest gets 4 beats of silence. Here is the whole note followed by a whole rest. We learned that the half note gets 2 beats of sound. Here's the corresponding rest, called a half rest. The half rest gets 2 beats of silence. Here is the half note followed by a half rest and repeated. The quarter note gets 1 beat of sound. The quarter rest gets 1 beat of silence. Here is a quarter note followed by a quarter rest and repeated. Okay, what about the dotted half rest. It is not customary for us to use a dotted half rest. If we want 3 beats of silence, we simply write a half note, a half rest followed by a quarter rest like this. Those are all of the note values we will learn today. I have a cheat sheet for you in your handout for you to use as a reference. Alright, let's go ahead and start to learn how to notate our easier rhythmic piece where everything falls on the beat. I will start out by showing you how to notate Ode to Joy because everything falls on the beat there. And then I will need to fill in some gaps because Ode to Joy doesn't cover rests and it doesn't cover whole notes and so on. So we will cover that after we learn how to notate Ode to Joy. First, like I said earlier, Songmaker doesn't allow us to sustain a note longer than one box, which is only half a beat. We will just have to use our imagination as to whether or not we want to rest. At this point, we're going to count each of these as a full quarter note.